Welcome back to The Exchange, a podcast featuring real stories, real people, and real purpose. I'm your host, Ruby Jones, and today I'm honored to bring you an inside look at Godspeed, a play by Los Angeles-based playwright and television writer Terence Anthony. Terence's work spans both stage and screen, including television writing for lawman Bass Reeves on Paramount Plus. His plays have been produced and workshopped at major festivals and theaters nationwide, and he's been recognized with fellowships from institutions such as the Gerasi Resident Artist Program and the Ragdale Foundation. Godspeed is a bold new theatrical adventure set in Texas in 1865, just after the abolition of slavery. The story follows Godspeed, a former enslaved person who escaped to Mexico a decade earlier, as she returns to her home state with a six-shooter, one bullet, and vengeance on her mind. Joined by a complex cast of companions, she embarks on a perilous journey across the frontier. As the play unfolds, her pursuit of retribution forces her to confront what justice truly means in the aftermath of profound personal and historical trauma. This production, steeped in the ethos of a classic Western, illuminates a chapter of American history that's often overlooked. It delivers an epic, character-driven experience for audiences, and I'm excited to explore Terence's creative process, the motivation behind Godspeed, and themes that make the historical story both timely and relevant. The world premiere of Godspeed will take place from January 30th to February 22nd at Denver Center for the Performing Arts Killstrom Theater. Be sure to reserve your tickets to this special presentation, and I hope you enjoy our meaningful conversation. I heard that you just landed in Denver recently and that you're hanging out here in the city. Where are you from originally?
Yeah, I'm from LA. I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, but been living in LA since 99. So LA's been home for a good amount of time.
Okay, nice. Well, welcome to Denver. This is not your first time here, is it?
Nope, nope.
Okay.
Yeah, came out 2 years ago for the New Play Summit. And my wife actually has some cousins that live out here. So I had been to Denver very short periods of time for like family reunion stuff. So
So you know this weather is not traditional.
no, I mean, I also know it can change at the drop of a hat, right?
Exactly. Yeah. During the holidays, I was joking that it felt like we were having an LA Christmas.
Yeah, I mean, I got on the plane in LA. It was cold and rainy, and then came to Denver. It was all sunny.
Oh, I would do anything for some rain right now. Well, I'm excited about Godspeed. And, your production would be playing from January 30th through February 22nd at the Killstrom Theater at Denver Center for Performing Arts. I would love to know, in your words, what is Godspeed about?
Well, the elevator pitch is Godspeed is a Western, a revisionist Western about a escaped slave who returns to Texas right after emancipation with a gun, one bullet, and vengeance on her mind.
That's a great synopsis. What made you want to start writing this play?
I mean, it really started with Juneteenth. I think about 10 years ago, I started thinking about what was it like in the weeks and months following emancipation in Texas. I'd heard two stories that, I remember about it was that Texas emancipated their slaves 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation because news traveled so slow that they just didn't know, that slaves were freed until 1865. And then I'd also heard that, once Granger and the Union Army rolled into Galveston, read General Order Number 3, that Black folks dressed up in their finery and went out and partied on the streets and everything. And, quickly learned those were not true, that Texans, slaveholders in Texas knew that the Confederates had lost. They knew that emancipation was the law of the land. They just weren't going to free their slaves until there was enough of a Union Army presence to attempt to enforce those laws. And that there was no partying that first Juneteenth, not legally anyways, because the second paragraph of General Order Number 3, states like all freedmen must remain quietly on their plantations, and gatherings and idleness will not be tolerated. So it was still, you're not slaves anymore, but we still control you. And to me, that was, those two things were sort of the beginning of thinking I need to look more into this and learn more about what it was like on the ground for, the people most impacted by this seismic shift in the culture at that time. And, the more I read, the more I realized this is truly a wild, wild west story. What was happening in Texas, the immediate upsurge in violence against Black folks after they were freed, once they were no longer considered property, the sort of economic deterrent stopping some folks from, running down and hanging up and committing violence against Black folks was gone. And so, yeah, I really wanted to write a play that kind of captured some of the chaos that was happening in those first few months. And to me, it was also a Wild West story that we haven't seen before.
I'm glad to hear you say that Juneteenth was the inspiration behind it. That's immediately what my mind went to when reading the description of the production. And here in Denver, we used to have one of the biggest Juneteenth celebrations in the country. And so we always kind of grew up knowing about Juneteenth. But I think when it became a national holiday a few years back, it produced this quandary of, do people actually know the story of Juneteenth, or are they just being told that there was a celebration and so we should continue that celebration? And another thing I think that's interesting that you said is talking about the era immediately following Juneteenth. And it's remarkable that you were thinking about that when creating this play and this, you called it a revisionist Western, because the Reconstruction era, I haven't really thought about it in terms of a Western, but that's exactly what it is with the migration and expansion. I do want to know, though, what inspired you to create the character as female, the main character?
Mm. Yeah, it was a process. I can look back at early drafts, early notes, and the main character wasn't always female. But I think there was a point where I thought, the character is going to be more interesting if the character is female. And I knew I wanted the character to, be an escaped, formerly enslaved person who comes back. So we can experience what's going on as the character experiences what's happening in Texas at that time, and coming back to, what's the most interesting reasons for this character to come back, what's going to be the most compelling and the most sort of narratively driven reasons for this character. And I thought, there, if it's a woman, I originally thought, well, maybe it's a guy, he's coming back to free his wife. But then it was like, well, are we going to really, go along with somebody who runs away and leaves their wife behind, And then, yeah, at some point I was like, no, it's going to be way more interesting for the lead character to be a woman coming back, and for reasons I won't reveal. But having the idea of what her vengeance journey is going to be just felt way more compelling to me.
Well, it might be an obvious question, but what was the urgency or the necessity of telling this story in theater?
I wanted to write it as a play because, one, you don't really see a lot of westerns on stage in this way. And as the story sort of took shape in my mind, it it felt so character driven. It felt so centered around these folks that were beginning to populate the story in my mind. I felt like this would be a really great way to experiment with the form of theater, and tried to really think about sort of how we can bring sort of the epicness, the vastness of that we see in most Western movies onto the stage, but root it really in character and in their interactions with each other.
It sounds like it's going to be one giant gift during Black History Month, and I'm excited about that. What are some of the central themes that audiences will experience?
The idea of what freedom is a big theme of the story. Godspeed, the main character, is in Mexico when she reads about that enslaved folks have been freed, and so she comes back with the one idea of what awaits her in this newly emancipated America, and what she finds is a very different definition of freedom, and the play explores that. It explores the sort of found family that folks who live on the margins often build around them, and in surprising ways sometimes, and unexpected connections. And I think also one theme is sort of the way that we as humans are able to use humor and get through these hard times with humor as well. I want My wife is always saying, you got to make sure you remind people how funny this play can be sometimes, like that it's not just this, down, slog through history. It's an adventure play, and the characters are all kind of offbeat in their own way. And, it's dark humor, but there are some laughs in this play as well.
Well, thank you to wife for the reminder. That's great. I mean, there's nothing like sitting in a theater and feeling a range of emotions, feeling the fear, the sadness, and then also being able to laugh and just have this human experience, I think is really what's transformational about the theater. So, as the audience is sitting through this journey and they're reflecting on the idea of Western expansion and Western migration through the lens of Godspeed, what do you want to stay with the audience long after the final scene, and what do you want people to be talking about when it comes to Godspeed?
Well, I want them to talk about what a wild ride it was and how much they're going to tell all their friends and family to go see it. The era of Reconstruction is something that I'm really fascinated by. And, the more I learn about it, the more I realize how little we're taught about it, and how much it gets buried in the history of America. And ideally, I want folks to come away thinking I need to learn more about this period in history. And when they do learn more, I want them to think about what this country could have been if Reconstruction had lived up to its promise, and where we would be, as a nation, if it hadn't been dismantled and Jim Crow had taken effect.
Hmm. Okay, so I have a question that's probably not the easiest to answer. And so I have a follow-up question if it's not easy to answer. And I guess my
Okay.
first question, my first question would be, do you think it's too late? Do you think it's too late for us to reach that promise as a country?
Yeah, good question. I think some days I think it's too late, to be honest. Some days I think, yeah, there's too much that's happened that we can't go back. We can't. Or the way we go forward is going to be very different than what we could have had if Reconstruction had stuck. I think optimistically there are still bright spots out there, and I think as people, as Americans, I do feel in my heart that there's hope still,
Yeah.
and that we can come together and figure out better way to move forward. That kind of keeps me going. I mean, a lot of the work I've done outside of creative work is sort of based on that notion that we can organize, we can work together to make things right. But it is easy to feel pessimistic, especially these days.
Thank you for that. You did a great job answering that. My follow-up question would be, as a creative person and in the midst of your creative process with this play, are you thinking about or are you inspired to write a sequel that maybe talks about more of the Reconstruction era? Or do you feel that Godspeed's story is done at the end of the show? Do we
Yeah, well, we'll see how it does. If there's a demand for a sequel, that would be cool. There's definitely more stories to tell. I
yeah.
think, for me, especially with my theater work, a lot of stories that I write are focused on, the era from emancipation to before civil rights, kind of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, those things. I have a number of plays kind of set between those eras, and as a theater maker, like I really want to continue to tell stories that capture those moments. And I think narratively it's also very rich, but it also the violence that happens to prevent progression, the dangerous kind of clinging to privilege and power that happened once slavery was abolished. We see the echoes of still today. We can look back at slavery and slave stories, and they all seem kind of abstract, right? Because slavery's over, it's done. And I feel that that's probably why we get way more slave stories told or produced than post slavery, because it's a little easier in some ways to look back and say, well, there's no more slave owners anymore. There's no more. But you look at Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the loitering laws and all these laws that came into effect basically to control Black folks once we were free, redlining, the prison industrial complex and the gross overrepresentation of Black folks and brown folks in the prison system. And those are there's a direct line to what happened during Reconstruction and afterwards to where we're at today. So, I'm really interested in telling those stories and, making sure that that piece of history stays alive in some way or another.
Thank you for telling those stories. I know they need to be told, even though I'm sure sometimes it's difficult to tell them or difficult to express the depth and the breadth of them. So thank you. And thank you for joining me today. I'm excited to see Godspeed January 30th through February 22nd at the Killstrom Theater. And I just wish you the best of luck on stage.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
I'd like to extend another thank you to Terence Anthony for sharing his insights and providing a sneak peek into this highly anticipated production. Godspeed invites audiences to reckon with history, justice, and the cost of survival. I encourage everyone to make plans to witness this powerful theatrical experience as it premieres in Denver from January 30th to February 22nd. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you at the theater. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more episodes of the Exchange podcast featuring real stories, real people, and real purpose.